And actually, let's move into the second part of the block because we have Netanyahu talking exactly about this. We're going to start, though, with Elon Musk because the two of them had a conversation when Elon Musk went to Israel this week and toured. Let's start with some clips. And some of the audio here is a little bit hard to hear, but there's some interesting stuff in here. So let's roll this one.
Last night, some of them returned home. Not home yet, but returned to Israel. And most of them were kidnapped from the houses open over here.
They murdered, especially
inside them in order to breach doors or windows.
I mean, obviously, there are three things that need to happen in the Gaza situation. I mean, there's no choice but to kill those who insist on murdering civilians. There's no choice. They're not going to change their mind. And then the second thing is to change the education so that a new generation of murderers is not trained to be murderers. And then the third thing, which is also very important, is to try to build prosperity.
So that's Elon Musk talking to Netanyahu in the first part of the clip, and we actually have more from a conversation they had that we're going to roll. I think we might as well just roll right into it because it's still very relevant. Here's that clip.
The Germans hold themselves up in German cities. Nobody said, well, don't attack the Wehrmacht, the German army, the Nazi army, because you have civilians there. In fact, that's exactly what the Allies did through the cities of France and the cities of Germany, and many, many, many civilians were killed. I don't know what history would be like if you had, the kind of mass communications that we have today, and protests would have been launched against the Allies on behalf of the Nazis, because as the German chancellor who visited Israel and saw these horrors, he said, Hamas are the new Nazis. Hamas are the new Nazis, and people are demonstrating either out of ignorance or out of malevolence. They're protesting for the wrong side.
I mean, it was troubling to see massive protests in almost every major city in favor of Hamas, they generally characterize it as sort of a Free Palestine movement.
Ren, obviously, a lot of international law was developed in the wake of World War II, and exactly what Netanyahu was talking about. We sort of came to a consensus, at least a lot of the West came to a consensus on what was appropriate uses of some of these vastly more powerful new technologies, military technologies.
Yeah, like the world, including the West, basically said, no, Dresden was not okay, actually.
And planes, by the way, are new in Dresden. We take it somewhat for granted now, but like planes were within 100 years of their existence. I mean,
decades
way
even.
less. We're talking decades into the existence of airplanes, and are being used in completely foreign ways to wage war that humanity had never seen before in World War I and World War II.
Right, and so, to go back and say that the things that the world, like they were the Germans were actual Nazis. Like you didn't have to stretch some weird comparison to say that all Hamas are Nazis or actual Nazis. And even in that situation, the West is like, okay, if we had it to do over again, Dresden is firebombing Dresden and killing how many tens of thousands of civilians for the sake of sowing terror was not actually necessary for the military end goal.
That was Elon Musk with Netanyahu on X, right? They were doing a Spaces conversation on X. So this was a public back and forth. That's the audio that you just heard. I mean, I think it's again putting Elon Musk in this strange situation, or I guess he's putting himself in this strange situation where we've seen the power that he has in Ukraine with Starlink. And then the tour with Netanyahu is also extremely interesting because it's, I think, underscoring the power that he has with X. And so he has this sort of like multi-front. On the info war front, the info operation front, he controls one of the most important, one of the largest platforms for social media, for media now, period. It's the public square. He controls it. And then on the other hand, he also controls and has the potential to control when it comes to, at least in Ukraine, and I know there's talk about how Starlink can function in the future and be expanded and used, the means to even engage in that discourse.
Yeah, and his point, Elon Musk is a very, very smart guy. And so when he says like really dumb things, I always wonder like what on earth is going on. So he talked about basically we need to re-educate people in Gaza, and then we need prosperity. I'm all with him on prosperity. Like basically the way that the troubles in Ireland, wind up is that the Ireland was given basic dignity, but also economic growth and opportunity. And so the costs of joining, Sinn Féin were higher because you had actual economic opportunities. The cost of joining Hamas for a 19-year-old kid in Gaza is zero because it's like a 75% unemployment rate. Now it's close to 100%. And so what else do you have to do? Like if you give people other options, they're going to take them. That's why you see kind of prosperity and peace in the end to conflict moving in tandem. So I think he's right on that. The education point was just absurd. I interviewed a guy who went to school in Gaza a couple weeks ago, and I actually asked him about what you hear about all the propaganda that Hamas and before them, Fatah, was giving to children in Gaza schools.
Yeah.
And you read some of it, you're like, yeah, this is gross stuff.
Yeah.
Like there's no doubt about it. But he made the point. He's like, you really think that in a situation where you're living under a blockade, where you have 4 hours of electricity a day, where your access to food and water is heavily restricted by the Israeli government, that you're unable to travel to visit your family in the West Bank or visit your family in Saudi Arabia or Jordan, you can't leave for college, you get sick, you need treatment in a hospital, you can't leave Gaza. He's like, under those conditions, you think you need a teacher to create resentment in you for the Israelis? Like how, like what, it takes only like one step backwards to think. And so after Israel produces a famine of biblical proportions, makes Gaza uninhabitable, what kind of education curriculum are you going to bring in and make the people who went through that believe that actually it was all okay?
I mean, there doesn't seem to be it's very hard to know how the public has reacted in Gaza to Hamas in the wake of October 7th, because obviously it's different. It's not all, Gaza is not a monolith. The Palestinian people are not a monolith. At the same time, though, there's a completely legitimate argument that they should be blaming Hamas for putting themselves in this. Hamas knew what it was going to trigger on October 7th and understood the response that it was going to trigger. And it does always understand the response that it's going to trigger. It's intentional. And that, I mean, in terms of where the blame is laid in the last couple of months, at least the last, since October 7th, that has to be part of the equation. And I think that a lot of the indoctrination is to prevent that. And it's not to say that obviously there are legitimate grievances that people have in Gaza against Israel. There's no question about it. But I mean, that's an important part of this puzzle. And I think that's why the Hamas propaganda comes in and tries to sort of be the block.
Right, but the Palestinians have seen this movie before in some ways. And so they know where this is going. So back in the early 80s, when Israel invaded Lebanon to clear the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, out of Beirut, after indiscriminate bombing of Beirut, after massacres, after huge numbers of civilian casualties, PLO basically waved the white flag and said, we will leave Beirut. And the Lebanese population at the time was like, good, because this has brought this massive catastrophe onto us. And so there were a lot of Lebanese who kind of turned against the PLO. The PLO asked the United Nations, the United States, to bring in kind of peacekeepers and an international force to protect the civilian population. The U.S. At the request of Israel said, no, we're not going to do that, but we will take Israel's word that if you leave, there will not be civilian massacres. And the PLO took them at their word. As soon as the PLO shipped out of the port in Beirut, all of the foreign monitors left. Israeli forces came in, leveled the place, and horrifying civilian massacres and a almost decades long occupation followed. And so as this started going on, the Lebanese people started thinking, well, hold on a second, maybe we don't actually want the only people who are capable of fighting back leaving. So I think that is also something that's playing out
Oh, totally.
in Gaza. Like,
Yeah.
they don't, a lot of Palestinians do obviously are finding themselves in a situation of hell on earth. But if Hamas just leaves, do they trust that Israel's going to come in and just peacefully rebuild the place? No, they don't.
Again, that's where we get into quagmire territory, and it's where we get into this question of like, how have they proven? How has anyone in the United States proven that the eradication, the destruction of Hamas is possible here?
Right. What does that mean?
I mean,
Right.
in all sincerity, and so without having that, it looks like it's headed for. There's nothing that's going to happen right now that's breaking any cycle.
Right.
It's just not going to be. It's not breaking the cycle. It's perpetuating the cycle. Nothing here is going to change, and we have no plan to anything that will change because you're not eradicating Hamas. You're not destroying Hamas. And if you do, say you do that, what comes into the vacuum, we also have absolutely no plan for except for more violence.
The only people that seem to have a plan, the only faction that seems to have a plan, are the ones who say, we're just going to lock this completely down, and we're going to basically empty out the population one way or the other of the Gaza Strip.
Right.
Which will then only leave a handful of West Bank regions to just keep under perpetual lockdown. Like that's the only end game that seems to make any sense. And I'm using the word sense in a neutral way, like not as something that anybody ought to support, but anything else, any other end game does not seem plausible given what's being done.
Right. No, I mean, I agree. Then what's worse is that we're not being given anything clear anyway. And that's because they know, I mean, it's like, it's a completely futile exercise to say like, oh yes, we have this very clear path to peace. We have a very clear path to, a better situation. There isn't one. And that's why we're not hearing
Right.
it.
And the roughly even populations between Israel and the Palestinian territories means that you'd have to have a huge either outflow of population elsewhere into other Middle Eastern countries, or the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in order for Israel to be actually able to carry out an occupation. Because if you have a population of 7-8 million trying to occupy a population of 7 to 8 million, you can't do that sustainably and indefinitely, because you also need those 7 million people to run an economy and to be a country. You can't just be a prison.
It's no minor difference between Biden and Netanyahu. Biden saying two-state solution, and Netanyahu saying, I'm not budging on this, period. There's no two-state solution. Basically, to have the two leaders say that within such close proximity to each other on the same day, again, it's not surprising if you follow both of these governments, but it should be shocking to the sort of conscience of where this hot conflict is going in the near future.
And to finish up with Elon Musk, we can put this last element up. Musk had suggested that he was going to make Starlink available to Gaza humanitarian outfits.
Right.
Israel pushed back and said, no, do not do that, because Hamas will end up using Starlink. And so Israel has now told Elon Musk that Starlink can only operate in Gaza with its approval. Their quote is basically, any operation of Starlink within Israel must have the permission of Israel, and that includes Gaza, which contradicts their kind of earlier claims that Gaza is like independent and that they've left it.
Right. Well, I mean, just we're almost 2 months into this hot conflict. We're coming up on the first week of December, which will make it 2 months. And the New York Times had a staggering, again, not particularly surprising, but a staggering report on the proportion, the apparent proportion of civilian deaths in this conflict.
Because women and children are making up like 80%.
From from several different ways that people have sort of crunched these numbers, and analysts have looked at them, and by what the information we have available right now, it does not compare favorably to other conflicts. It does not compare favorably to Fallujah. the U.S. prosecution of the Iraq War in Fallujah, even there, where there's high civilian casualties, what we're seeing right now appears to be a really a much worse proportion of civilian deaths to militant deaths to fighter deaths. It's hard to know. I get it. These numbers are difficult. Although Ryan, you guys at The Intercept have actually earlier in the conflict, you were able to validate some of the numbers that were coming out, but. All that is to say, when you have that situation juxtaposed with the lack of direction from these governments, the lack of clear sort of paths forward, it's a disaster.
And we might find, and how horrifying is this, that the proportion of civilian casualties carried out by the Israeli assault on Gaza will be higher than the proportion of civilian murders by Hamas on October 7th. And that is not at all to defend or minimize what Hamas did on October 7th. What it does do is it puts in context the brutality of what Israel is doing here. If Hamas even had a lower proportion of civilian deaths in what we all agree was a horrifying atrocity, then what does this count as?
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.